Imagine you've spent the last 3 years fighting a brutal war across North Africa, believing everything your government told you about the enemy nation. You've been told that America is weak, divided, on the verge of collapse. You've been taught that certain races are inferior, that democracy is chaos, that only rigid military discipline and racial hierarchy can build a great civilization. Then on a humid summer morning in 1943, you step off a transport ship in Norfolk, Virginia, and everything you've been told shatters in an instant. What you see in that first moment will haunt you for the rest of your life, not because it's horrifying, but because it's impossible. American dock workers, both white and black, operating side by side with machinery that looks like it belongs to a future century. Women in work coveralls operating massive cranes. Children selling newspapers at the gates without a shred of fear. American sailors in uniform walking past without even a glance at the enemy troops just arriving on their soil. Nobody runs. Nobody hides. There's no panic, no hysteria, no security paranoia. This is the story of over 425,000 German prisoners of war who landed on American soil between 1942 and 1945 and experienced something that would fundamentally shatter their entire worldview. It's not a story about military heroes or dramatic escape attempts, though those elements appear. It's not primarily about the brutality of war, because there is remarkably little brutality in this tale. Instead, it's the story of how a nation at war, so secure in its power, so confident in its values, and so fundamentally decent, that it treated mortal enemies not as threats to be crushed, but as human beings to be educated, rehabilitated, and ultimately transformed. This transformation happened not through propaganda or coercion, but through the simple act of living in America. By witnessing American abundance, American freedom, American chaos, and American kindness, these men who arrived convinced of Nazi racial superiority and German military destiny would leave as advocates for democracy. And when they returned to Germany after the war, they carried with them a vision of a different kind of nation, one that would eventually reshape Europe itself. The arrival at Norfolk Naval Base, the journey across the Atlantic in June 1943, took nearly 2 weeks, and by the time the transport ships pulled into Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the German prisoners were exhausted, disoriented, and gripped by anxiety about what awaited them. These weren't fresh recruits or low-ranking soldiers. Many were non-commissioned officers from the legendary Afrika Korps, the elite force that had fought under Field Marshal Owen Rommel across the deserts of North Africa before being captured in Tunisia. They were experienced soldiers, educated men, many of them products of the German military academy system. They believed they understood how the world worked. What they didn't understand was about to become the central mystery of their captivity. Unoffizier Hermann Butcher, a non-commissioned officer who would later document his experiences in a memoir published in Germany, gripped the ship's railing as he descended the gangplank. His legs were unsteady from the voyage, his uniform disheveled from weeks of confinement. Through the morning haze of the Norfolk docks, he witnessed something that contradicted everything he'd been taught about America. The docks sprawled across 4,300 acres. Ships were being loaded and unloaded simultaneously from dozens of different berths. Cranes operated with mechanical precision that seemed to belong to another era, entirely machinery so advanced that nothing comparable existed in German ports. But the machinery wasn't what stunned the prisoners. It was the people operating it. Black American dock workers and white American dock workers labored side by side, apparently without incident or division. In Germany, such a thing was legally impossible. Racial mixing in the workplace was forbidden by law, by Nazi ideology, and by military regulation. Yet here, in the most casual manner imaginable, it was simply how work got done. The dock workers weren't specially selected or supervised for this racial mixing. This was simply the American way of organizing labor. Women in coveralls operated the massive cargo cranes, their voices calling out orders that other workers obeyed without question or comment. American naval officers walked past the prisoner formations with barely a glance. Civilians wandered through the docks seemingly at will. Vendors sold coffee and donuts within sight of massive naval vessels. Children worked as newspaper sellers at the gates, entirely unsupervised, showing no fear whatsoever of German uniforms. To Butcher and his fellow prisoners, the entire scene looked like madness. He whispered to the man standing behind him in formation, Die Spin und die American Amerikaner. The Americans are crazy. But the prisoners' first shock came not at the docks, but during the processing that followed. German military doctrine, refined across Poland, France, and Africa, held that prisoners were either assets to be exploited or burdens to be minimized. The Geneva Convention was acknowledged when convenient and ignored when not. Germany itself maintained a brutal and inconsistent approach to prisoner treatment. The Nazis had murdered millions not just in industrial death camps, but through a systematic starvation policy towards Soviet prisoners of war that killed approximately 3 million men. Yet when American officers began processing the German prisoners at Norfolk, they did something the prisoners had never witnessed. American officers explained the Geneva Convention requirements in fluent German. They explained the prisoners' rights. They asked about dietary requirements. According to International Red Cross records from June 1943, Jewish American personnel including several sergeants with distinctly Jewish surnames distributed Red Cross packages while calmly explaining that kosher meals were available for any Jewish prisoners who wanted them. Several Wehrmacht soldiers laughed nervously at this. They assumed it must be mockery. That the Americans would make some kind of elaborate joke before revealing the true treatment. It wasn't a joke. The American military had actually prepared for the religious dietary requirements of enemies. German military medical personnel worked alongside American doctors, receiving the same penicillin that was barely available to German field hospitals back in Europe. Swiss Red Cross inspectors noted in their reports that medical treatment provided to German POWs equaled or exceeded that given to American military personnel. When the first meals were served, German prisoners sat in mess halls where American sailors were also eating. Not separated by countries, but simply by sections of the same facility, eating identical food from identical lines, prepared with identical care. The Americans showed virtually no interest in their enemies. They were more focused on a radio broadcast of a baseball game than they were on German troops sitting 50 feet away. For men who had been taught that Americans were soft, divided, and weak, this casual indifference to their presence was somehow more unsettling than any hostility would have been. It suggested that the Americans didn't consider them much of a threat at all. The enigmatic train journey, the 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the camps in the interior of America, became a kind of extended fever dream for the German prisoners. Unlike prisoner transfers in Germany, which were conducted secretively, with prisoners hidden in sealed boxcars to prevent any contact with the civilian population, the American authorities made absolutely no attempt to hide the German POWs. The prisoners traveled in actual passenger coaches with cushioned seats, not the standard boxcars used for freight. The trains stopped at regular stations throughout the East Coast and slowly made their way south and west. At each stop, civilians gathered to observe. American families waited on platforms to see off soldiers headed to training camps. Wives kissed husbands goodbye in full public view. Children waved flags. Teenagers sat at station lunch counters sipping milkshakes, apparently without a care in the world. At Union Station in Washington, D.C., hundreds of Americans watched as trains containing German prisoners pulled into the station. Local newspapers documented the scene. German prisoners watched American families engaged in what seemed like the most ordinary, beautiful, and incomprehensible sight imaginable: the casual freedom of a nation at peace with itself, even in the middle of a global war. The trains passed through industrial areas that should have been camouflaged, hidden, protected from enemy observation. Instead, factories displayed their names in massive letters on their roofs. The Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Plant in Baltimore had enormous parking lots visible from the train windows, filled with workers' personal automobiles. German prisoners with military training could count the B-26 bombers lined up for delivery, sitting out in the open with no attempt at concealment whatsoever. According to Butcher's memoir, one Wehrmacht officer turned to him and said quietly, "They're not even hiding their military production from us. Either they don't care that we're seeing it, or they're so confident in their ability to produce more that secrecy doesn't matter." The implication was clear: if American production was so vast that they didn't need to hide it even from enemy prisoners, then Germany had already lost the war in an industrial sense. The war might continue for years, but it was already decided. Through Pennsylvania, the trains passed coal mines and steel mills running continuous shifts. The night sky glowed orange from blast furnaces that never stopped. The landscape was transformed into something barely recognizably an industrial civilization operating at full capacity. Workers' housing spread for miles around each industrial complex, not barracks but individual houses with gardens. Electric lights burned in every window. Radio antennas sprouted from every roof. At a stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, documented in Pennsylvania Railroad records, German officers watched American workers at shift change. Men carrying lunchboxes, wearing leather shoes and wristwatches, driving personal vehicles. According to Butcher, one worker threw away a half-eaten apple and opened a fresh one from his lunchbox without any hesitation whatsoever. This casual waste of food proved more psychologically devastating than any combat experience these men had faced. Officers who had watched their men fight over scraps in Africa, who had rationed food to the point of starvation for lower-ranking troops, who had seen German civilians subsisting on meager rations, they now watched American laborers simply discard food that would have been treasure in Germany. One officer wrote to his family, "The workers here eat better than our officers eat in Germany. They waste more in one day than a German family sees in a month. If this is the nation we are fighting, we have already lost. Not because of their weapons, but because of their abundance." Camp Hearn, Texas. A comprehensive world Camp Hearn, located on 720 acres near the small town of Hearn in Robertson County, Texas, became home to approximately 4,800 German prisoners. It opened in December 1942, making it one of the first and largest POW camps constructed specifically for German prisoners in the United States. The camp would become the central clearinghouse for mail for German POWs throughout the entire country, a role that gave it enormous cultural significance within the prisoner population. The infrastructure of the camp was designed with a level of thoughtfulness that astonished the arriving prisoners. Instead of the basic, minimal housing typical of military installations, Camp Hearn featured wooden barracks with electric lights rather than oil lamps. Each building had indoor plumbing with flush toilets and hot water heaters, luxuries that many German soldiers had never experienced even in peacetime. Individual beds with mattresses, sheets, and blankets replaced the straw pallets that were standard in German military barracks. Recreation halls contained ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and libraries stocked with books. Swiss Inspector Emil Sandstrom noted in his August 1943 report, "Conditions at Camp Hearn exceed not only Geneva Convention requirements, but surpass the living conditions many of these men knew in Germany." The camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecile Stiles, had studied German at university before the war. When he addressed arriving prisoners in their native language, explaining camp rules and procedures, he communicated something unprecedented in the prisoners' experience. The camp commander was not primarily a military administrator enforcing discipline through fear. He was an educated man who had bothered to learn the language of his prisoners, and he treated them with respect. But the most revolutionary aspect of Camp Hearn was the introduction of limited self-governance. Prisoners were allowed to elect spokesmen who would represent their interests and communicate with camp administration. They were allowed to organize their own activities and manage their own schedules within the military requirements of the camp. For officers accustomed to rigid hierarchies and absolute obedience to superior rank, this introduction of what might be called democratic procedures was deeply confusing. How could a military organization function if prisoners had any say in their own governance? How could discipline be maintained? And yet, Camp Hearn remained orderly and secure. The system didn't collapse. Morale actually improved under the new arrangement. It was yet another piece of evidence that contradicted everything these men had been taught about how societies functioned. The camp hospital was equipped with medical technology that many German civilian hospitals lacked. X-ray machines, surgical suites, dental chairs, and pharmaceutical supplies, including the revolutionary new drug penicillin. When prisoner George Gartner developed acute appendicitis in September 1943, he received surgery within hours, performed by Captain William Calhoun, an Army surgeon from Dallas, with German POW medical staff assisting. The surgery was successful. Gartner survived and would later escape from a different camp and live in America illegally for 40 years before voluntarily surrendering in 1985. The camp canteen might have been the most psychologically destabilizing aspect of Camp Hearn's operation for the prisoners. It was a store where prisoners could purchase goods using scrip earned from voluntary labor. Cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing materials, musical instruments, art supplies, items that went far beyond mere survival. The War Department authorized these sales, believing that small comforts would maintain prisoner morale and reduce escape attempts. The concept that enemy prisoners could shop, could make purchasing decisions, could have wants beyond survival, could choose items for recreation rather than necessity. This scrambled the military thinking that officers had been trained in. Prisoners weren't supposed to have comforts. They were supposed to be restrained, controlled, monitored for security risks. And yet the American system seemed to assume that treating prisoners decently would actually reduce security problems rather than create them. By September 1943, severe labor shortages throughout Texas led to German POW employment in agriculture and non-military industries. The War Manpower Commission, in coordination with the Provost Marshal General's office, authorized prisoner labor programs. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, exactly the same base pay as American privates. This wage system meant that German prisoners were literally earning the same money as American soldiers for their work. Records from the camps show that the vast majority of prisoners who had the opportunity to work chose to do so. Voluntary participation in work programs exceeded 87% among eligible prisoners. These were men who were imprisoned, separated from their families, held against their will, and yet most of them volunteered for work when given the opportunity. Why? Partly it was the pay, which could be used in the canteen. Partly it was the change of routine and the mental health benefits of having meaningful work. And partly, according to prisoner testimonies, it was the simple fact that being treated as if you were capable of meaningful contribution even when you were technically an enemy transformed how you saw yourself and your captors. Education programs and intellectual liberation. In early 1944, the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's office established sophisticated educational operations at Camp Hearn. Declassified records reveal the extent of what prisoners at the time only knew as voluntary education. It was, in fact, a carefully designed program of ideological and intellectual transformation. The camp library, initially stocked with 500 books donated by citizens of Hearn, grew to over 5,000 volumes by August 1944. The American Library Association ran a Books for Prisoners program that provided texts including works by German authors that had been banned by the Nazis. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Works by Jewish authors like Leon Feuchtwanger that would have meant death to possess in Nazi Germany. The significance of this library program cannot be overstated. German prisoners had the opportunity to read books that their own government had deemed dangerous, subversive, or degenerate. For the first time in years, they could encounter ideas that had been systematically suppressed. And crucially, no one forced them to read these books. The decision to read them was voluntary. The decision to engage with dangerous ideas was their own. Sam Houston State Teachers College, now Sam Houston State University, provided correspondence courses. College records show that 340 German POWs enrolled in courses including English, American history, mathematics, and agricultural science between 1944 and 1945. Professors from the college visited Camp Hearn monthly to conduct lectures and examinations. German prisoners had the opportunity to pursue higher education while in prison, something virtually unimaginable in the context of war. The camp also had its own newspaper called Der Spiegel Marora publication that evolved dramatically over the course of the war. Early 1943 editions contained what appeared to be Nazi propaganda. By late 1944, the newspaper featured democratic discussions and critiques of Nazi ideology. Declassified Special Projects Division documents reveal that this transformation wasn't accidental. It was carefully orchestrated by American military psychologists and German immigrant advisors. The program identified three categories of prisoners. Anti-Nazis, comprising approximately 10% of the population, were identified through careful screening that included analysis of letters, conversations, and reading choices. Non-political prisoners made up about 75% of the population. And ardent Nazis comprised the remaining 15%. Each group received different treatment designed to maximize ideological transformation. Anti-Nazi prisoners, identified through subtle testing and observation, received additional privileges and education. They became barracks leaders, discussion group moderators, and newspaper editors. Their influence on the non-political prisoners was carefully cultivated and monitored by American military psychologists. The screening process developed by Army psychologists was sophisticated and subtle. Prisoners' reactions to news of German military defeats were documented. Their book choices from libraries were recorded. Their participation in educational programs was monitored. Their social interactions were observed. Weekly reports tracked ideological shifts across the camp population. According to declassified documents from November 1944, written by Major Maxwell Knight, the assistant executive officer, the transformation rate exceeds expectations. Approximately 60% of non-political prisoners show measurable movement toward democratic ideals after 6 months of exposure to American society and targeted education. This wasn't propaganda in the traditional sense. It wasn't speeches or coercive indoctrination. It was education, exposure to information, opportunity for discussion, access to books and ideas. And it was working. The American military had discovered something that would have profound implications for the post-war world. Ideologies could be transformed through exposure to freedom and education, not through force or propaganda. Work programs and industrial shock. When German POWs from Camp Hearn and other Texas camps began working in American agricultural and industrial settings in 1943 and 1944, they received an education that no classroom could provide. They saw American capitalism, American productivity, and American industrial organization in action. And what they saw fundamentally altered their understanding of what was possible. At the King Ranch near Kingsville, Texas, a ranch that covered 825,000 acres, larger than the state of Rhode Island, German prisoners encountered American agriculture on a scale that defied European comprehension. Ranch records from 1943 to 1945 show that German prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and some black ranch hands in cattle operations. The racial mixing in work, though limited socially, directly contradicted Nazi racial hierarchy theories. Prisoners documented their amazement at mechanization in letters that passed military censors. A single combine harvester replaced dozens of workers. Trucks, not horse-drawn wagons, transported crops across vast distances. The ranch even used aircraft, small civilian planes to survey cattle herds and spot strays. This was industrial agriculture at a scale and level of mechanization that simply didn't exist in Europe. At cotton gins throughout Texas, including documented operations in Taylor, Caldwell, and Waller counties, prisoners witnessed processing speeds that seemed impossible by European standards. The Hearn Cotton Oil Mill, which employed POW labor from August 1943 to December 1945, processed more cotton in a single day than German textile mills handled in an entire month. But the most psychologically significant aspect of these work programs was not the speed or scale of production. It was the treatment of workers and the relationship between productivity and human treatment. At the Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, where prisoners handled materials from September 1943 onward, workers discarded more aluminum scrap in a single day than German aircraft factories could acquire in a week. Plant records show German prisoners were assigned to scrap collection, giving them direct exposure to American industrial waste. The abundance was overwhelming and incomprehensible. Food processing plants provided the most shocking psychological experience. At the Stokely Brothers Cannery in Cameron, Texas, verified through Milam County historical records as employing POWs from nearby Camp Hearn, perfectly edible produce was routinely discarded for minor cosmetic flaws. Tomatoes slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernels, beans with minor blemishes, all destroyed while German civilians faced starvation. A letter from POW Corporal Friedrich Miller, preserved in Red Cross archives, stated, "Today we destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit because it did not meet canning standards. Fruit that would be treasure in Germany is garbage here." The American supervisor apologized to us for the waste, not understanding that he was apologizing for abundance we couldn't imagine. The most profound discovery prisoners made in these work settings was that productivity through good treatment actually exceeded productivity through harsh discipline. American workers took regular breaks. They ate full lunches. They listened to radios while working. They were not driven relentlessly. And yet their productivity far exceeded that of German workers who labored under threat and constant supervision. One officer noted in a letter home. The American supervisor explained that workers who are treated well and allowed to rest actually produce more. We have always believed that productivity comes from discipline and fear. Here, productivity comes from the confidence that hard work will be rewarded and that you are valued as a worker, not just as a laborer. German prisoners also discovered that American farmers discussed politics openly. FBI monitoring reports, declassified in the 1970s, noted that German POWs were shocked by farmers criticizing Roosevelt freely, complaining about government policies without fear. At one documented incident at a farm near Bryan, Texas, a farmer told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell over crop allocation disputes. The farmer faced no consequences. Such defiance of authority would have meant death in Nazi Germany. Here it meant nothing. Here, even in wartime, people could criticize their government with impunity. Here, free speech wasn't just a theoretical concept, it was something ordinary people exercised routinely. The extraordinary Christmas of 1943, the Christmas season of 1943 at Camp Hearn, became one of the most documented and most emotionally significant events of the entire American POW experience. The response of the town of Hearn, population 2,000, to the prospect of German prisoners spending Christmas in captivity, revealed something profound about American values and the American response to enemies. The entire town mobilized to ensure that German POWs had a proper Christmas celebration. This wasn't a policy mandated from above. This was a grassroots community decision to treat enemies with kindness and dignity. The Hearn Democrat published a full list of donations on December 23, 1943. Local churches collected 4,800 individual gift packages. Schools contributed handmade cards and decorations. The American Legion Post 164, composed of veterans of World War I who had fought against Germans, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment to current German enemies. The Lions Club provided musical instruments. The Garden Club decorated the camp with holly and evergreen boughs. The camp Christmas tree, photographed for the newspaper, stood 30 feet tall in the main compound, decorated with electric lights that burned continuously. Quartermaster records show the camp used more electricity for Christmas decorations than most German villages had for all purposes. Such an electrical display would have been unthinkable even in peacetime Germany, when electricity was rationed and carefully controlled. Local churches performed Christmas concerts in German for the prisoners. The First Methodist Church Choir learned German Christmas carols phonetically, under the direction of Mrs. Sarah Patterson, whose son was serving in Italy fighting against Germans. Choir members stood before German prisoners and sang to them in their native language while their own sons and brothers fought against Germany. According to guard reports and documented testimonies, the psychological impact on the prisoners was devastating in the most profound way. One prisoner wrote, "These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us gifts. Their kindness wasn't weakness. It was the confidence of victors who knew they had already won not just the war, but the peace that would follow." The Christmas feast menu, preserved in quartermaster records, included roast turkey 1 pound per man, ham, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce, mince pie, apple pie, and ice cream. Beer was provided for enlisted men, California wine for officers. The meal totaled approximately 5,000 calories per person. Meanwhile, German civilian rations, when available, provided 1,200 calories daily. German prisoners in America were eating nearly 4 times the calories that German civilians at home could obtain. The contrast was not lost on the men. Many of them would later recall Christmas 1943 at Camp Hearn as a turning point, the moment when kindness became more destabilizing to their Nazi worldview than any military defeat could have been. Herman Butcher, the officer who had whispered on the dock that Americans were crazy, would later write in his memoir that Christmas 1943 was the beginning of his transformation. "These people gave us gifts while their own sons fought and died. I could not reconcile this kindness with everything I had been taught about enemies and war and national survival. If kindness was weakness, then weakness was winning. If generosity was a sign of decay, then decay was creating miracles. I realized in that moment that we had been fighting the wrong enemy all along. Confronting American race relations, the American treatment of German POWs raised profound and troubling questions about race and equality in American society. The contradictions were stark and often recorded by prisoners themselves. At Camp Hearn, Negro soldiers from the 359th Infantry Regiment occasionally served guard duty over German prisoners. German POWs, products of Nazi racial ideology that taught absolute racial hierarchy, found themselves taking orders from black Americans. Several prisoners requested transfers rather than submit to authority from black men. Their requests were denied by camp administration. Lieutenant Colonel Stiles stated in a December 1943 report, "German prisoner objections to Negro guards are noted and ignored. The prisoners had to accept it. They had no choice. And in accepting it, they witnessed something that contradicted Nazi ideology at its Korea hierarchical military organization that functioned perfectly well with black soldiers in positions of authority over white soldiers. But the contradictions ran deeper. German prisoners could eat in Hearn restaurants that refused service to the Negro soldiers who guarded them. They could attend movie theaters where their guards couldn't sit in the main section. German enemies had more social freedom in some contexts than American citizens who happened to be black. This paradox, being treated better than some Americans while being enemies, scrambled ideological certainty. One prisoner wrote, "We are treated as guests while American citizens are treated as lesser beings. This makes no sense to me. Either we are enemies who should be punished, or we are humans who should be respected. But to treat us better than fellow citizens based on skin color? This is madness that contradicts everything I understand about justice and hierarchy." At agricultural work sites documented in Farm Security Administration records, prisoners worked alongside Mexican American and black laborers. The efficiency of mixed-race work crews when focused on tasks rather than race challenged Nazi theories about racial purity equaling productivity. German POWs picked cotton alongside black workers who outperformed them, directly undermining assumptions of racial superiority based on genetics or inheritance. One farmer wrote to Camp Hearn administration, "Your German prisoners work hard, but my black workers outpace them every time. If your racial theories were correct, this wouldn't happen. Yet it happens every day." The American racial system, deeply segregated and fundamentally unjust by modern standards, paradoxically served to undermine Nazi racial ideology in the minds of German prisoners. Prisoners witnessed black Americans functioning as successful farmers, skilled workers, reliable soldiers, and productive members of society. They saw Mexican Americans operating businesses and managing agricultural operations. They saw women working in positions of authority. What they saw contradicted Nazi teachings. And that contradiction, repeated daily in work details and camp interactions, gradually eroded the ideological foundation of racial superiority that had sustained their worldview. The structured re-education apparatus, while the casual exposure to American society was transformative on its own, the American military also implemented a more formal re-education program designed to systematically challenge Nazi ideology and introduce democratic concepts. The program was sophisticated and carefully constructed. Military psychologists and German immigrant advisors identified potential democratic leaders among the prisoner population and provided them with additional education and access to information. These identified leaders were placed in positions of influence within the camps as barracks leaders, discussion group moderators, and newspaper editors. The screening process used to identify anti-Nazis versus ardent Nazis was subtle but comprehensive. Prisoners' reading habits were monitored. Their reactions to news of German military defeats were recorded. Their conversations were observed by informants. Their social interactions were analyzed. Over time, camp administrators built detailed psychological profiles of each prisoner's ideological orientation. The most ardent Nazis were segregated. The most hardcore Nazi supporters were transferred to Camp Alva, Oklahoma, which became a specialized facility for prisoners deemed too committed to Nazi ideology to remain in the general population. This segregation served multiple purposes. It prevented Nazi prisoners from dominating and terrorizing non-political prisoners. It allowed anti-Nazi prisoners and non-political prisoners to develop their own camp culture without constant Nazi pressure and propaganda. This segregation itself became a revelation for prisoners. The American military was willing to segregate based on ideology, but it was doing so not to punish or brutalize the Nazis, but to protect the other prisoners from Nazi control and intimidation. The Nazis at Camp Alva were still fed, still housed, still treated according to Geneva Convention requirements. They weren't punished for their beliefs. They were simply separated to prevent them from controlling others through terror. One prisoner, interviewed after the war, reflected, "I realized that Americans believed in freedom so deeply that they would protect our freedom to think differently from Nazis. The Nazis at Alva were still prisoners, still treated decently. But they couldn't force us to think like them anymore. That was freedom, the ability to believe differently without threat or coercion." Educational programs expanded dramatically in 1944. Prisoners attended lectures on American government, American history, and democratic theory. They read newspapers and listened to radio broadcasts that criticized the government. They watched newsreels showing the 1944 presidential election campaign, in which Roosevelt faced serious challenge from Republican Thomas Dewey. They saw newspapers publishing opposition views. They watched political cartoons mocking the commander-in-chief. Yet the war effort continued, even strengthened. This demonstration of democracy's strength through discord rather than despite it fundamentally challenged authoritarian assumptions. Nazi ideology taught that unity required total control, that dissent meant weakness, that free speech in wartime meant defeat. Yet here was a nation at war, with open political debate, with candidates challenging the sitting president, with newspapers criticizing military leadership, and the nation was producing more war material than the rest of the world combined. One officer noted in a letter, "America's greatest strength is not that it forces unity. It's that unity emerges from freedom. People work harder and produce more when they believe in the system they're working for. Germans work because they're forced to. Americans work because they want to. In the end, Americans will outproduce us because their system creates willing workers, not enslaved ones." The remarkable escape and evasion stories. One of the most remarkable statistics about German POWs in America is the escape rate. Of approximately 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States during World War II, only 2,222 escape attempts occurred. That's less than 1%. Only 54 successful escapes lasted more than 30 days. 0.01%. The escape rate was so low that it confounded military planners. When the program began, authorities were terrified of mass escapes endangering American civilians. They implemented security measures, hired guards, built barbed wire fences. But the prisoners rarely tried to escape. Why would enemy soldiers, imprisoned thousands of miles from home, choose to stay in captivity? The standard military answer is that escape to Canada or Mexico was difficult, that return to Germany was impossible, that the Geneva Convention required repatriation at war's end anyway. But those explanations don't fully account for the psychological reality. Prisoners chose not to escape because they were being treated decently. Because work was available and wages were paid. Because the camps had educational opportunities and recreational facilities. Because food was adequate and medical care was available. One prisoner, interviewed decades later, explained it simply. "Why would I escape to face death trying to reach Canada or hide illegally in America, when I was safe, fed, and learning English in the camp? I was a prisoner of war. The war would end eventually. When it did, I would go home. But while I was here, I might as well survive." The escape attempts that did occur reveal interesting patterns. Some were motivated by romantic relationships. Some were motivated by adventurousness. Some, particularly among the hardest-core Nazis, were motivated by honor, the belief that a soldier should attempt escape as a matter of principle. But one escape case became legendary. George Grinner's 4-decade evasion. George Grinner was captured by Allied forces in Tunisia in May 1943, part of Rommel's defeated Afrika Korps. He was transported to the United States and held at Camp Deming, New Mexico. In September 1945, as the war was ending, Grinner made his escape. Rather than attempting to flee the country, nearly impossible with the continent split between Allied occupiers, chose to hide in America. He assumed the identity of Dennis F. Wiles and lived illegally in America for 40 years. He worked as a tennis instructor in California. He married an American woman. He lived a quiet, law-abiding life, avoiding attention, paying taxes, living as a contributing member of American society. Then, in 1985, at age 64, he contacted Professor Arnold Kramer, the foremost expert on German POWs in America. Together they published Hitler's Last Soldier in America and Grenay.